It's my pleasure to welcome back Paul and Phillip Collins to the show. Paul and Phillip collaborated in writing *The Hidden Face of Terrorism* and *The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship*. They frequently contribute to Conspiracy Archive. They come back to discuss their article, "The Androgynous World Order: Feminism, the LGBTI Movement, and the Abolition of Gender." They wrote that back in 2014. But I thought it was particularly timely given the insanity we see with LGBT rights, or at least the claim of LGBT rights, and the apparent declaration of war on North Carolina by the New World Order for having temerity to pass a law restricting bathroom use based on biological sex. Paul and Phil, how are you doing today?
Doing fine, Kelly. Doing well.
This gender insanity seems to have reached new heights and appears to enjoy the full backing of the corporate state. Clearly, there's an agenda afoot here. You wrote this article. Let's get into it. The Androgynous World Order. What's going on here?
Well, basically, we start off the article with an examination of the ideational foundations of feminism. And we conclude that feminism is, in essence, a Gnostic political religion. Now, as such, understanding the movement stipulates an understanding of Gnosticism. So while a discussion of Gnosticism might seem tangential, it will actually prove to be germane to the present topic. So please bear with me. Mm-hmm. Gnosticism was that most pervasive of heresies, one of the leading challengers of the early Christian church. It began like so many other ancient theological dissensions. It originated with a fragmentary recognition of a truth, which was subsequently situated within an incongruent context. Like Orthodox Christians, Gnostics correctly identified a diminution in man's distant past, but the Gnostics situated that fall within the context of creatology, which is the science of humanity's first days. Creatology asks the question, why did God create the universe? Now, Christianity, of either the Greek patristic tradition or the Augustinian tradition, contended that the motive was love. And so as a product of love, the cosmos and its inhabitants were inherently good. And they recognized the Eastern Christian tradition recognized the entailments of this assessment, and in so doing advanced a theology that was marked by an anthropological and cosmological optimism. Now, Augustinian theology exhibited a distinct anthropological and cosmological pessimism, in contradistinction to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and this probably was a result of a reactionary response to Pelagianism. It also was probably a bit of a product of Augustine's Manichaean past. He had been a Manichaean, which was basically a Persian Gnostic religion, and he had converted. And some of the vestiges of that belief system might have followed along with him, and that's why he fell into this anthropological pessimism, which was extrapolated further into a cosmological pessimism. But that disparity between Augustinian theology and Eastern Orthodox theology aside, the Western variant of Christianity still identified the same causative factor underpinning the fall. The fall occurred subsequent to the act of creation and was imputable to man's intangible will. This decline, though, was reversed by Jesus Christ's redemptive work on Calvary. Thus, the restoration of man's goodness was rendered as an attainable eschatological hope. Now, in contradistinction, Gnosticism contended that the act of creation was motivated by ignorance and hubris. For the Gnostic, the biblical God was an ignorant being whose existence resulted from the hypostatization of another supracosmic deity's errant desires, namely Sophia. Sophia was this deific being who emanated from the pleroma, what they called the pleroma, which was this singular deific power with which man used to be ontologically one. Sophia emanated from that, and emanating from Sophia was supposedly the biblical god Jehovah. Now, that this Monotheistic depiction of the biblical God was a direct corollary of the Gnostics' assignment of ontological being to evil. The Gnostics understood falsity and error in terms of ontology instead of moral orientation. Evil was viewed not as a tendency of the will, but as a substantial reality that interwove itself into the very ontology of creation. And this understanding of corruption contrasted sharply with the church fathers, who believed that evil lacked independent substance. Now, from the patristic vantage point, evil constituted a negation of being, and as such, it held no place among the existent. While its corollaries are painfully real, error, evil, corruption, it's not real in and of itself. Its point of origin is the intangible will, not the tangible world. And appropriately enough, St. Maximus, the confessor, characterized evil as a perfect nothing.
And if I may just throw in right here really quick, in St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation, he says that that God started with nothing and brought something into being, something out of nothing. And then after the fall, something began to degenerate and began to move back towards nothingness.
Exactly. That's where I was headed. Since evil is a perfect nothing, the will that adopts evil's existential trajectory inexorably migrates toward nothing. So in this sense, evil represents an inversion of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Where God created everything out of nothing, evil returns everything to nothing. It's a negation of being. Accordingly, those who align their wills with evil migrate back towards the oblivion of non-existence. So in this sense, evil is actually a self-immolating impulse of a disordered will. It is a consuming nothing. It reduces the elemental constituents of creation to non-existence.
St. John Chrysostom also dealt with this issue when he used the account from the Gospels where Jesus performs an exorcism. He sends these evil intelligences into swine, and the swine run off a cliff. And Saint John Chrysostom says that this account provides a perfect example of what unrestrained evil does. It leads something into self-destruction.
Exactly. Now, when one conflates error, when one conflates corruption and evil, the darkness, with the palpable domain, that necessarily leads one to associating corruption with the author of the palpable domain, the very creator. In fact, error and falsity become the author himself. And this conflation is exemplified by a passage from the Valentinian Gospel of Truth, wherein it's declared, and I'll quote it verbatim for the edification of the audience, "Error became powerful. It fashioned its own matter, foolishly not having the truth. It set about making a creature with all its might, preparing in beauty the substitute for truth." So in other words, God was error. The biblical God, Jehovah, was evil. And from the Gnostic vantage point, the creator of the visible physical cosmos, he must have been in error. He was in and of himself in error. And in fact, he was not merely the originator of error. Error was interwoven into his very ontology. This monotheistic indictment, which stems directly from the belief that evil possesses an ontological or substantial being, was correctly identified by St. Basil, a church father who was certainly no stranger to heresy. He was an opponent of Apollinarianism. He was an opponent of Arianism. That's the whole reason why he wrote on the Incarnation. Correction, St. Athanasius wrote on the Incarnation, but St. Basil also opposed Arianism on the same grounds. St. Basil upheld the Nicene Creed and endeavored to protect the early church from the tides of heretical thought. But St. Basil understood that if the world rulers of the darkness opposed the good according to their substance, then the blame would rebound to the creator. That's his own words. That blame would essentially rebound to the creator because one identified evil with substance.
It's a logical procession. If the physical world is evil, then the creator of that physical world must be the author of evil, must be evil himself.
And this all stems from a misidentification of evil as being a substantial form, something possessing substance, something possessing ontological being.
And the saints that attended the Council of Nicaea seemed to appreciate that fact, and that's why Arius was, his ideas were expunged, and he was basically sidelined.
Yeah, well, Arius wasn't a Gnostic though, but he did fall into the same theological error that the Gnostics did, because he denied God's immanence, and that's where he decided that that's what led him to decide that Jesus was not homoousia with the Father, of one essence with the Father, but instead was homoiousia, a created being with like essence unto the Father. But at any rate, if evil constitutes an independent substance, it either issues forth from an equally corrupt God, or it exists as a self-sufficient principle that is co-equal with God. So should the substantive depiction of evil hold sway, God either becomes a malevolent demiurge, or he can no longer lay claim to a divine exclusivity. And meanwhile, evil's true point of origin, namely the intangible will of man, is overlooked. So since the substantive view of evil necessitates certain monotheistic assumptions, any theology that follows from those premises must either condemn or exonerate God. And the Gnostics chose both courses of action. In Gnostic theology, the exoneration of God basically entailed the rejection of the office of creator. From the Gnostic vantage point, the possession of a creative faculty would have automatically undermined God's sacrosanctity, and basically he could no longer be considered good. And so, in keeping with their docetistic proclivities, their proclivities towards matter-loathing, the Gnostics believed that being absolutely transmundane, completely divorced from creation, was a prerequisite for the sacrosanctity that one would associate with God.
And we unfortunately see this today, where any kind of sacramental form of Christianity is kind of is ridiculed, such as those of the Roman discipline with in Catholicism, those of Eastern Christian sects are here in America. They seem to be ridiculed because of their sacramental nature and everything, and a more Gnostic kind of Protestantism has kind of risen up here in the West, which throws out almost all of the sacraments because of this kind of derision for matter.
Yeah, but at any rate, God the Father had been completely disassociated by the Gnostics from creation. Now, that radical disassociation entailed basically stripping the true God of all creative faculties. And this arbitrarily imposed disjunction between God the Father and God the Creator would permit the Gnostic to resculpt the supreme deity according to more docetistic contours. According to the Gnostic schematic for a perfect deity, God the Father was free of any creative role, and as such was divorced from the alleged corruption of the created order. Gnosticism's divorce between God and creation was rationalized within radically dualistic frameworks, wherein the true God was rendered absolutely transmundane, and the material cosmos was portrayed as a cosmic abortion. So to place a sufficient ontic distance between the Father and creation, some Gnostics even went so far as to formulate elaborate cosmologies involving lesser deities and a rigidly tiered heavenly the set of heavenly localities. And in addition to proffering a framework wherein an inherently evil creation remains separate from an incorruptible Father, such cosmologies also acted to kind of camouflage the antagonistic dualisms promoted by the Gnostics that the early church would have deemed untenable. That's why so many Gnostics managed to remain within the ranks of the early church, was because their elaborate cosmologies kind of helped to camouflage their docetistic proclivities, this docetistic cosmological attitude that they held. But at any rate, the Gnostics viewed the biblical God, of course, as a product of an alleged schism within the pleroma. And thanks to the supposed disunity among the divine powers, humanity was thrust into the oppressive finitude of matter. We were all of a sudden found ourselves fettered by the physical laws of nature, by the objective morality typified by the Mosaic law, which was imparted to humanity by what the Gnostics considered an inferior God. And the pneuma, or the spirit of man, found itself separated from the one true divine pneuma, the true divine pneuma, the truly transmundane Father God, who was considered separate from the Creator God, and man was in a perpetual state of alienation. And for the Gnostic, this state of alienation was really attributable to the existential status of physical embodiment. And of course, physical embodiment gives rise to a multiplicity of qualitative distinctions. As you know, no one single person is exactly like the other. There are certainly many commonalities among human beings, but there are also innumerable differences. And this anthropological variance among humanity conflicted with the Gnostics' collectivist spirituality. Again, the Gnostic fall was not the result of sin, but of division within the pleroma and the subsequent creation of matter. So supposedly man was once part of this pleroma, and his existence therein was a state of pure, indistinct collectivity with the divine. So it was kind of a soft form of autotheism. Man existed homoousia with God, of one single essence with God. And this is entirely different from the Eastern Orthodox conception of theosis, which was communion with God, but maintaining ontological distinctions from God. Instead, the Gnostic advanced apotheosis, which is union with fusion, commingling of human essence with divine essence. But at any rate, that purity was lost with humanity's descent into materiality through the biblical God's errant act of creation. And the errancy of creation was tangibly evidenced by the natural order's diversity, a quality that contrasted sharply with the ontological homogeneity that humanity once knew within the pleroma. So opposing the created order's differentiation necessitated a revolt against nature. And in this sense, the Gnostic revolt against nature actually qualified as a kind of normative monism. Now, it's true that the Gnostics were dualists. They advanced an antagonistic dualism between matter and spirit. But the Gnostic believed that no such distinction should have ever existed. Instead, reality ought to have been a single essence, and that undifferentiated absolute ought to have been an exclusively spiritual one. Alienation from that reality was, according to the Gnostic, attributable to physical embodiment, and the material body, which creates distinctions, which the Gnostic deemed the source of all evils. That physical body had to be considered a form of entrapment, of pure light.
And we see this bad thinking running on autopilot right up to this very day. For instance, our good friends, the Taliban, who are in this symbiotic relationship with the Western powers, in controlling Afghanistan, which is part of a larger plan of controlling Eurasia, generally going back to the great game that evolved between Russia and Britain. You see that they would take these Buddhist statues, these Buddhist icons, these Buddhist monasteries, just blow them up, just destroy them and everything. So, I mean, that's just one example of how this derision for matter this Gnostic derision for matter has been running on autopilot up to the present day, and that's just one of many manifestations.
Well, at any rate, that this revolt against nature, the Gnostic revolt against nature, it is with that one identifies the foundations of feminism. Okay, because the possession of sex organs is a defining feature of physical embodiment. Gnosticism, expressed this tacit derision for the gender categories of male and female. As a matter of fact, some Gnostic texts promote androgyny as this form of salvific union. Likewise, feminism enunciates this virulent contempt for traditional gender categories and occasionally bemoans the entailments of female biology. In fact, it was the feminist Simone de Beauvoir who once declared that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one through social discrimination. So where the Gnostic deemed the material cosmos a corrupting simulacrum, the feminist deems the social cosmos a deceitful matrix wherein the supposed fiction of gender is socially constructed. And presumably, the feminist possesses the requisite gnosis to recognize this simulacrum. And ironically, de Beauvoir's claim of gender socialization, one could argue, is socially constructed because it originated within the context of a social movement. Ergo, it's either illusory or it's false. But nevertheless, this claim echoes Gnosticism. Firstly, it echoes the Gnostic refusal to impute corruption to the human will. Instead of recognizing that evil arises from the intangible human will, from a disordered human will, the feminist externalizes evil and concretizes it in the form of a chimerical patriarchy.
And if I may just throw in really quick here, this is probably what the revolutionaries' perennial dissatisfaction is attributable to. And feminists are revolutionaries, and they keep on having to remake the world over and over and over again in search of utopia, and and believing that we'll get it right this time. We'll get it right this time. Utopia will come this time. The perfect world will come this time with this revolution, with this bloodshed, with this radical and violent overturn of society. We'll get it right this time. All the while, the problem that needs to be remedied is located in the will, and people making willful, purposeful decisions that are bad, that are wrong. And so, this misidentification of where the problem starts and where it originates leads to perennial dissatisfaction on the part of revolutionaries, generally speaking, but feminists specifically, and leads to a never-ending revolution.
Essentially, revolution, it really represents ideologized Gnosticism, more specifically ideologized Docetism, because it expresses a dissatisfaction with the cosmos, in this case being the social cosmos, whereas the Gnostics derided the created cosmos, the revolutionary derides the social cosmos. But they express this contempt for the social cosmos in its present state, and so it must be changed. And the ideologization of Gnosticism, it really took place, in my opinion, it took place during the Enlightenment, which the 18th century Enlightenment constituted something of a Gnostic revival. Many Enlightenment theoreticians were well aware of Gnosticism and praised its merits and reiterated Gnosticism. Voltaire, for instance, wrote Plato's Cave, which is, for all practical purposes, Gnostic cosmology. Rousseau's advancement of the noble savage, the hypothetical state of nature, which contended that man was inherently good being before he was corrupted by the imposition of civilization. This reiterates the Gnostic contention that evil is not imputable to the will, that evil is external, that evil possesses ontological being, in this case, in the form of social constructs.
Or John Locke, who's considered the Moses of the Enlightenment. I mean, he had a screwed up anthropology, which held that man was living in a kind of anarchistic bliss, and government rose up as a necessary evil to keep people from taking his stuff.
Well, with John Locke, of course, was influenced by Descartes, and out of from the tradition of John Locke, you would essentially have the likes of Immanuel Kant, who was one of the eminent, foremost theoreticians of the Enlightenment, advancing this rejection of the adequation between the mind of the percipient and reality. In other words, reality was imperceptible. Man's epistemic faculties were considered woefully suboptimal, and therefore his perception of reality could not be considered reliable. Which, of course, is, in a sense, an affirmation of the Gnostic contention that the world is a simulacrum. It also acts as the premises for the disteleological argument, which holds that because created beings, because organisms have certain suboptimal features now, that reflects it reflects either an impotent God or it reflects no God whatsoever. And this sort of disteleology you also find just lacing Gnosticism. The world is meaningless, is purposeless. And of course, this was eventually codified into a philosophical movement known as existentialism, which was, the foremost theoretician of which was Jean-Paul Sartre, and of course the core claim of the existentialist movement, the core claim of disteleology itself, is just it's not logically sustainable, because if you're going to contend that the universe is meaningless, that life is meaningless, then you cannot meaningfully enunciate such a contention. And yet you see existentialists, exhausting enormous volumes of pages to advance this disteleological outlook. I mean, like being and nothingness clocks in at somewhere around 500 pages. So all the while they're attempting to compel you to accept the disteleological outlook as a meaningful proposition.
The one guy that could have migrated us away from that would have probably been Albert Camus. I think that if Albert Camus had lived longer, he might have become a Catholic, or he might, because if you look at what he starts, he's saying, well, it's absurd, it's meaningless, but you got to try to find meaning, and so he started to explore the idea that meaning could be found in the struggle against absurdity and everything. But unfortunately, he died before he had fully refined his ideas.
Well, and at any rate, it's with the Enlightenment that you see really the codification of Gnosticism into a revolutionary doctrine.
But you can see, Tim, where these revolutionaries, which are, have codified Gnosticism, you can see now why they would be so useful to the power elite, because they're perennially pissed.
That was the point I was going to make, is feminists, Marxists, Bolsheviks, they seem to be proxy soldiers for an elite, the banker elite, the ruling elite. And like you said, they're perennially pissed, so they can be easily mobilized and used.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you're going to conduct these social engineering projects, such as what the power elite have been doing for centuries now, you need a class of people that are mad all the time. And you need that because you are relying on the destruction and on the chaos that such a class of people rots.
Well,
As long as you can direct it, as long as you, and have been times, granted, there's cases of blowback, and cases of
Well,
of somebody getting off on a rogue
well, yeah,
trajectory.
yeah, that this happens. I
They
mean, honestly,
stall it. So
revolutions are contrived, but they take on a natural path, or they take on a life of their own. Once you get these,
exactly,
especially proxy, it's hard to control proxy soldiers because
exactly.
by the very nature they lack discipline. But
Exactly. Whole books have been written over
yeah.
the phenomenon of blowback. Well, that's basically addressing that issue there.
And the people orchestrating, let's say, the precipitative act can also profit from the blowback because they don't take blame for it.
Yeah, they find ways to harness. They find ways to harness
Yeah.
the blowback because there's a plausible deniability there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, of course, when I'm thinking about this androgyny, this Gnosticism basically it states that creation is an error. Therefore, when we look at nature, natural law, and expressions in nature, how things are, whether it's male, female, these things aren't errors that need to be reversed or changed or done away with. And two revolutionary.
I'm sorry. Well, I was about to say the feminist revolutionary treats them as oppressive constructs that are being foisted upon her and her sisters
Yeah.
as tools of oppression, but they're really determinants. They're determinants of identity. That's the funny contradictory nature of this. They're saying that gender constructs prevent them from being the masters of their own destiny, from being the ones who determine their own identity. But in fact, these are what define identity. Gender is one of the determinants that defines identity.
Yeah, and if I may also point out another problem with the feminist logic. Okay, let's assume for the moment
Logic
gender,
is a male construct.
yeah, logic is misogynistic. But let's assume for the moment that gender is socially constructed, that it's a social construct. Okay, let's concede them that point for a moment. Okay, I could argue otherwise, but I'll play devil's advocate and I'll concede them that point. Even if that were so, to merely identify gender roles, so the point of origin, with society is not to invalidate it. Now you're committing the genetic fallacy. All you've done is demonstrate from whence the ideas came. And could it not be that perhaps society had constructed these roles because there was a time during which society communed with reality on its own terms, that society acknowledged biological realities? I'm sorry, the social construct argument does not work. It commits the genetic fallacy and it's self-refuting because, again, the very notion of social constructs is socially constructed because that concept originated within the milieu of a social movement.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and also the conventions and customs that I guess that pervade society or form society are often a reflection of the natural order itself. So although conventions can be modified or reformed, they are a reflection of an objective reality.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It just because even if you could demonstrate that gender is a social construct, even if you could demonstrate that it was socially constructed, that doesn't invalidate it because
all that could merely mean is that society constructed it because society recognized certain objective truths, objective biological realities, and behaved accordingly.
Table manners, right?
Right, like table manners. Well, let me ask you this. Okay, the parental admonition to not speak to strangers, that's socially constructed. Does that make it false? Does that invalidate it? Does that falsify it? I don't know if anybody has bothered, checking the news occasionally, but there are people out there who like to snatch up children.
Yes.
And
yep.
So
all it is it's a recognition of the more predatory class within our midst.
Yeah, so
that's all that is. So it's actually a sound safeguard, and all. I don't care who constructed it. It benefits the children. It benefits potential victims. It benefits the innocent. So
yeah, well, and so you can't.
Same way you could say moral teachings, traditional teachings regarding sexuality, sexual morality, also reflect a natural order.
Exactly. Exactly.
A reality to sex. That's procreative. Yeah. And it's unitive and procreative. So the Catholic Church teaches that in order to be both unitive and procreative, man and woman should be married and they should be open to creation. And
right, exactly.
And that fulfills that, and that protects society because it makes sure that children are a product of a unitive act, which means they have the benefit of a family, a community, and you don't have all the social pathologies and problems we have that we associate with single parenthood.
It's funny because the left, which seems to provide us with provide the elite with the rogue gallery of revolutionaries that they need more than the right even. Mm-hmm. They espouse a concern for the environment and a concern for nature, and if you're going to remain consistent in that concern for nature, we see it manifested in the environmentalist movement. We see it manifested in this call to somehow shrink the carbon footprint.
Yeah.
But if you're going to show a concern for nature, then you've got to also consider the fact that sex is part of nature, and that there is a sexual nature, and that needs to be preserved. There's a right way and a wrong way of doing it.
But the reason that this is so advantageous to the criminal elite, to deviant elites, is because the modern Gnostic advances this belief in complete absolute human plasticity. There is nothing given in a man. There's nothing given in a woman. There are no determinate properties.
So now we're back to the Moses of the Enlightenment. We're back to John Locke, who said that man was a tabula rasa, and that's probably where the whole idea of assuming a revolutionary identity, at least from the 18th century onward, at least leading into closer to modernity. Actually, you can probably trace people assuming a revolutionary identity all the way back to the Tower of Babel. But that's where you could probably trace it to as far as the modern world's revolutionary identity. John Locke asserting that man is a tabula rasa. So it's like, hey, we can write upon this tabula rasa. We can write upon this blank slate using the tool of revolution, using the tool of uprising and overturning the social order.
Right. Now, a good example of that would be, at least a modern example of that would be feminism's view towards abortion, where it becomes kind of a holy right.
Right, exactly.
Where talk about the having hatred for creation. That's the ultimate act, right?
Right, and
killing your offspring.
Right,
and also the good example is what people today now. It's not a question of what you are. I am a woman. I am a man. It's what you identify as today.
What you identify as, and again, that's the modern philosophical tradition of rejecting the adequation between the mind of the percipient and reality itself. Reality becomes malleable. I mean, reality becomes this very pliable construct that one can reshape to their own to suit their own pneumopathological yearnings.
Okay, so I know in the article we're running short of time, so I want to get this in here. In your article you talk about Gloria Steinem, the CIA, and feminism, and also the promotion of homosexuality by the same interested parties, by the same elite, and this is ultimately goes back, as you've said earlier, this traces back to Gnosticism, although I don't think the activists are aware of that lineage, but people like Gloria Steinem, feminism, and also the rise of gay rights in the 1970s. This wasn't organic. This was planned out by the foundations, the think tanks, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the CIA. And you cover that in your article. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it goes back to the Rockefeller Foundation. It goes back to we'll just say, generally speaking, the tax-exempt foundations, because that's really the nexus between the Rockefellers' fortune and the intelligence community specifically, but the United States government generally speaking. If you look at, for instance, the Ford Foundation, there's where there, that's one of the conveyor belts of elite money into the intelligence community and into the government, so as to direct both of those entities in the direction that the power elite wants them to go. And also there's also a kind of revolving door between government and these private institutions that keeps this kind of evil symbiotic relationship going. For instance, if you look at John Foster Dulles or you look at Dean Rusk, both of them they went from being with the Rockefeller Foundation into major roles within the government. They both were secretaries of state and all. But Nelson Rockefeller was probably the big guy as far as the tie between the power elite and the intelligence community and the government, because he served on the National Security Council. I believe he was placed there by Eisenhower in 1954. He had direct briefings whenever he wanted with Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, especially over things like MK Ultra. So he was the chief Rockefeller scion that provided the nexus between the intelligence community and the Rockefeller family. And if you look at the Rockefeller family, if you look at the causes that they funded, one of those causes was feminism. And we share in the article an exchange that went on between Aaron Russo, who's the deceased movie producer, screenwriter, director, and his friend, which was Nicholas Rockefeller, who was part of the Rockefeller dynasty. He was part of the law firm of Troop Messenger, Stuber, Passage, Reddick, Toby. Gosh, you got to be awake to say that. And I believe he also most importantly, I mean, he has Nicholas Rockefeller has a plethora of business and governmental connections, but if I recall correctly, one of the most important that stood out like a sore thumb was his participation on an advisory board of the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation has the Center for Asia Pacific Policy, and I believe he served there and everything. And during this conversation, this exchange between Russo and Aaron Russo and Rockefeller, Nick Rockefeller asked Aaron Russo. He's like, Aaron, what do you think brought about? Where do you think modern feminism came from? What do you think women's liberation is all about? And Aaron Russo, of course, he was like the rest of us, gave the canned response. Well, women's liberation is about procuring the right to vote for women. It's about getting equal pay for women. It's just about putting women on equal footing with men. And Rockefeller in response starts laughing, and he says, "Aaron, you're an idiot." And Russo said, "Well, why am I an idiot?" And Nick Rockefeller, goes on to say, "Well, there were two reasons why we did this. There's two reasons why the Rockefeller dynasty financed the women's liberation movement. First of all, we financed it. Second of all, the reason that we financed it was to basically bring the women into the workforce, so you have a larger portion of the population that's now being taxed and all. And the second goal was to basically destroy the traditional family. And because once women are in the workforce, there's nobody at home to take care of the children. The children have to spend longer and longer hours and time in government institutions such as schools, daycare, what have you. And so it gets rid of it gradually gets rid of the family, which nobody seems to understand what the family is today. Basically, the family is the human ecosystem. We look all around us and we see all these different species, and we see their ecosystems. We see the tropics. We see an Arctic setting, and we instantly recognize this as the ecosystem for certain given species and certain given animals. What's the ecosystem for the human being? It's been right under our nose all this time. It's the family, because because an ecosystem is basically an interrelated system. It's a community of organic organic beings, of biological beings and all. And in the case of the family, it's the ecosystem that develops the value system for the children and gives them a sense of identity, gives them a sense of a reasonable sense of individuality. So basically, Nicholas Rockefeller was making it clear that the goal was to destroy the human ecosystem, again, the Rockefellers were involved in the intelligence community, especially through Nelson Rockefeller, through Rocky, and so they had a direct line into the CIA through individuals like Alan Dulles. So it's really no surprise to find that the CIA played this real significant role in bringing Gloria Steinem to the point of celebrity and apotheosis that she reached in the 60s. And the really funny thing is, Tim, is that when the CIA grabbed hold of her, she was a nobody. And if it wasn't for the support of the CIA, she probably would have stayed a nobody. I mean, if you look back at her back in 1958, she had just gotten back from a trip to India. She made friends with Gandhi. She made friends with the revolutionary humanist M.N. Roy. But after she returned, she was spending time just sleeping on the floors or on the couch of friends' apartments. And basically, what happened is that Steinem was asked by a CIA operative if she would become the head of the Independent Service for Information of the Vienna Youth Festival. And this youth festival was basically it was a student kind of get together. It was a student enterprise, if you will, but it was CIA financed, and it was basically the way that the CIA was trying to bring the non-aligned countries into the orbit of the United States, because we're talking about that we're going back to that Cold War milieu where we have the Soviet Union on one side and we have the United States on the other side. Then we have a series of non-aligned nations that basically become the children that in this dysfunctional family, this great divorce that's going on, and the two parents, the Soviet Union and America, trying to win the custody battle. And
what you had with feminism, not only did the cause receive the direct patronage of the foundations, but also through their, I guess, indirect control of academia and the media. That's another form of patronage, because you see this being promoted in movies, in music, commercials, in academia, these things. So pretty much the entire establishment got behind these so-called radical movements. That, of course, that begs the question, why would the establishment support radical movements, right? Because the best way to control the opposition is to be the opposition.
Well, the funny thing is that Steinem would later, after years later, after she headed up the Independent Service for Information on the Vienna Youth Festival, and all, years later, she would admit that the CIA was there financing her work, and that the CIA was using her and others like her to try to bring these third world countries that had attendees at the festival into an American orbit. And she said, she basically, paraphrasing her, is she said, I didn't run across conservatives or fascists in the CIA. What I found was progressives. What I found was more left-leaning, progressive thinking individuals. And so my cause lined up perfectly with their cause and their agenda.
Yeah, which goes, basically they control the dialectic. So you can find whatever you want in the CIA, probably fascist and socialist, feminist and gay rights and all that. Now, of course, we're talking about androgyny, and of course, androgyny. Ultimately, I think we're dealing. I'm only because I got to close it out soon.
Sure.
It comes down to, I think, ultimately depopulation, because obviously, if you meld the sexes or create sexual ambiguity through the culture, through chemicals, for whatever, family dissolution. I think if you break up the family, you have smaller families. You create an environment that's much more traumatic, which means you can literally produce more homosexuals because there are more people being abused and being traumatized in general. These people will not form cohesive relationships or families, and not form families. You don't have families. You don't have extended families. You don't have extended families. You don't have communities. So these things can be broken up, and it gets into this. It's almost like a perverse alchemical process going on here. And really, to back that up, in 1969, the U.S. government asked Planned Parenthood to produce some suggestions for the supposed overpopulation problem. I think the document recording that meeting that was held is the Jaffe memo, recorded by a Planned Parenthood employee. Some of the recommendations included forced sterilization, abortion on demand, promotion of abortion, and also the promotion of homosexuality. Much of what we know of that meeting, I think, is based on the recollections of a Dr. Richard Day, who is the National Medical Director for Planned Parenthood. And in that meeting, he described the New World System, where sex will be separated from marriage and reproduction. That's sexual liberation. In order to break up the family and reduce the population, abortion, divorce, and homosexuality will be socially acceptable. Homosexuals will be given permission to act out. Everyone, including the elderly, will be encouraged to have sex. It will be brought out in the open. Anything goes. And just like the song, right, of 30, 40 years before. And it's not too surprising at the same time we had, 1969, the Stonewall riots. A few years later, 1973, you had Roe v. Wade. So all this is being pushed. You had the coming out of the gay rights movement, which, this is what ultimately does, it separate. The goal is to separate sex without reproduction, and reproduction without sex, and therefore relegate it to the laboratories, like artificial insemination, and to limit the family size. So the ultimate goal was depopulation.
Agreed. And obviously, population control is one of the objectives of the elite. They want a manageable population because ultimately they are not concerned with carrying capacity so much as they are concerned with the capacity of their control. And so fewer people means fewer individuals that you have to manage. And of course, population control, that originated with Thomas Malthus. Mm-hmm. And of course, Thomas Malthus's statistical data informed a lot of Darwin's findings, and Darwinism itself, evolutionary theory itself, qualifies as something of a Gnostic myth because it dignifies the soteriological claim of self-salvation with the metaphysical claim of self-creation. And so you can see where Darwinism also helped to establish the cultural milieu within which feminism would come to thrive. But I believe that the ultimate end game is not even just population control, so much as it is the eradication of human identity entirely. The gender is a significant determinant of one's identity. And clearly, the elite do not want people with a sense of self. And so what people are doing now, quite literally, with the LGBTI, QY, XYZ, blah, 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 and with these movements, they are literally promoting a form of codified self-erasure. People are actually in the process of finding themselves, or so they think. They are destroying themselves.
It's the culture of death.
It's the culture of death.
Yeah.
And there is nothing, there are no determinate properties to the individual now. The individual is being lost.
So you create the androgynous kind of drone creature that's supposed to inhabit the New World Order, just a nameless, faceless worker bee that's supposed to become the new species in the New World Order. And so it's not at all. We don't find it at all a coincidence that there's a lot of insect iconography among the different secret societies that have played a large contributing role in bringing the New World Order about.
Well, effeminate males and butch women aren't going to reproduce very well. So
right, exactly. And I mean, this is interesting because it's promoted as a quest for self-discovery, a quest for self, but it ends in self-erasure. And the same thing happened with Gnosticism. Gnosticism's soteriology was ostensibly radically individualistic. They mostly shunned the community, and that's why the communal setting of the church did not appeal to them. But their soteriology, this radically individualistic soteriology, actually led to the eschatological hope of reabsorption into the pleroma being just where human identity is immersed into this singular deific power. And so you can see where that entire eschatological yearning has been transposed into the immanent sphere and politicized. Now, it's the interesting thing though is it's backfiring against the feminists. But for instance, feminism, they love to emphasize the cause of ending domestic violence. Bear in mind that they never seem to acknowledge the fact that domestic violence occurs against men, but they want to end the justifiably deplorable act of beating a woman. However, if I want to beat a woman, all I have to do is identify as a female and become an MMA fighter and enter the ring with a female MMA fighter.
Which has happened. We got
which has happened.
This transgender MMA fighter gets in the ring with a female fighter.
I heard about that. Yeah,
and just beat the snot out of her, almost killed her. And another way in which this has gotten off the rails, I know that you're pressed for time, Tim, but another way that this has gotten off the rails is because of the divorce the intentional divorce between sex and reproduction. We're seeing the world is growing slower. The population is growing at a slower rate, and we're going to peak out soon, and we're about ready to start hitting depopulation. And Philip Longman, who works for the New American Foundation, which is a left of center foundation, has even pointed this out. He's pointed out that people are not reproducing, replacement births are down, and so and without those replacement births there, you don't have the people that are going to that are necessary to maintain the social and economic and political stability that the New World Order will need. So it's going to end. And another thing that Longman pointed out, he pointed out that births were the lowest among people who identified as citizens of the world, as opposed to citizens of a given nation state. Yes. And everything. So the globalists are literally sterilizing themselves out of existence. Yeah. And he also I believe that we believe that the traditionalists will win the culture war by default, because the only people that are producing almost up to par with what would be considered replacement levels and are people of the book. And Philip Longman pointed this out. People of faith, people who received a divine mandate to be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, that just returns to the original point that's recognized, particularly in the Greek patristic tradition of Christianity. Evil is a negation of being. Exactly, Evil migrates back towards non-being, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Yep, and the future belongs to the fertile. So,
yep.
Well, listen, we're pressed for time. I wish I could go longer today. I usually do. But
that's cool.
No, that's cool. Intervene. And we'll talk again. Some of the other articles are fascinating, and I'll send you an email in a month or so. Maybe we'll arrange something for the fall.
Sure.
Sounds good. Sounds great.
Something. I wish we could go longer today. This is fascinating. Reference point, you did an interview with Jay Dyer about a year and a half ago on this particular article. It was a lot longer, a lot more detailed, and I highly recommend that interview. Maybe I'll link it when I post this, because it's
we did get to go a little bit more into the CIA pedigree of Gloria Steinem. But I think that we got to lay out a lot with you here today that's profitable to the audience.
Yeah, we made most of the time. So listen, I'll let you both go and enjoy the afternoon out there.
We'll do.
And it's called, again, the article.
The article is the Androgynous World Order. It's at Conspiracy Archive. You can just find that in the Paul and Philip Collins section of conspiracyarchive.com.
Yeah, that and all the other articles make for good light reading, right? So listen, both of you, thanks a lot, and have a good day.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
Bye-bye.